Good evening. We are continuing our study with personalities and understanding our own personalities and also understanding those of others to help us to maintain the unity of the Spirit. Some people had asked, and I have several of these assessments. It says personality test. It's really more like an assessment. Sometimes people hyperventilate when they see test. But it's really just it's an assessment. It has strengths and weaknesses from personality types, and they're all jumbled up. So you can take one of these. I've got 25. It's easy to make more copies if we need more. I think I got 25 there. But if you want one, just you can raise your hand. Martin will hand one of these out. You can find to grade these if you want to do that. I've told people probably the easiest way. I've got it set up on my computer where I can plug that in and get your information to you in just lickety split. But some people said, I don't know if I want you to know my personality type. So I don't know. Probably if I know you at all, I know your personality type. I've figured out enough with this. It's interesting because you meet people and you interact with people and you say, okay, I think I know. And sometimes you're right, sometimes you're not. But if for whatever reason you don't, then that's okay. I can try to get you to a resource that'll help you do that. But I'm just thinking in terms of ease, to make it the easiest. It's probably easiest just to you can give it to me and I'll plug that in for you. But if you'd rather do it the other way, I'll help you do that as well. We're on our fourth personality type, melancholy. I meant to take out the animations on this. We kind of introduced melancholy. We talked about the strengths, positives, one of those being analytical. Obviously this can be taken to an extreme, but a melancholy personality type, they tend to analyze things, and that's not bad. God is organized. These people are thinkers. I'm getting ahead of myself, but the analytical is dealing with thinking. They think before they act, typically speaking. And so they're also more interested in truth and facts than they are popularity and politics. Sometimes a sanguine can become so interested in being popular that they sell out the truth, so to speak. That's a danger of the sanguine personality type, but typically a strong melancholy, that's not going to be a concern because they're going to be most concerned about the facts. That's that analytical side. We talked about the fact that they're organized. Again, in this aspect, a melancholy is really taken after the heart of God because the amount of organization you see in Scripture with Jehovah and the Godhead is really, it's amazing. So, again, it can be taken overboard, but organization is a good thing. We talked about, trying to imagine a building program for a church without having a melancholy helping out with that. These are also very talented people. They tend to be the geniuses of society. They tend to be the innovators and things like that. And so your melancholies are extremely talented people. In fact, they will many times do things that even will make another melancholy personality type just go, wow, that is something else. They never cease to amaze with their creativity and talent. But there are, of course, some negatives. As with each personality type, there are weaknesses or negatives that you want to be on guard against. A melancholy can become depressed. All personality types are susceptible to depression, but the melancholy perhaps more so. They're easily disappointed. We talked about this because we live in an imperfect world. The melancholy, as you recall, is the perfectionist. And in a perfect world, everything is A, B, C, D. But we don't live in a perfect world. Ever since the fall of man, sin entered the world, and it's not A, B, C, D on to Z. It's A, Z, X, and it's just all jumbled and out of order. And so the answer to that is to focus on Christ. He is perfection. So you want to focus on perfection. I don't know what happened there. Melancholy negatives, sometimes they can be pessimistic. These are intelligent people. They like details, facts, figures, but sometimes, of course, numbers don't add up. Again, in the real world, sometimes the numbers don't add up or things don't turn out the way they should by the numbers, by the facts, by the statistics. And that can really frustrate a melancholy. The depression and pessimism can sometimes be connected. Sometimes faith can be replaced with being realistic. Remember, we talked about this last week, and that's what a lot of times you'll hear, and maybe you've said that if you have a dominant melancholy personality. Maybe you've said that to somebody. Well, I'm not being pessimistic. I'm just being realistic. And that's how they'll view it. And sometimes it is. And I realize there's oftentimes a fine line between being realistic and being pessimistic. But be careful for that, because as we talked about, the melancholy member of the church might think they're being realistic, saying, well, it can't be done. I remember when GBN was just beginning back in 2005, Thanksgiving Day of 2005. Well, it was Friday. It was midnight Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. They went on the air. But I had begun working with them at that point. I'd accepted a position. I was finishing out the year at Blue Cross. So I remember so many people saying, I think it's a great idea, but I just don't think that can be done. I mean, you're talking a brotherhood-wide, there's going to be a budget up around $2 million. You can't do that. Well, was that being realistic? In a sense, I mean, it was huge. It was a big deal. Highland was a church, the overseeing congregation at that time was a church of about 100 people or so. It by all accounts, it looked realistically impossible. But they did it. And there were times when even sanguine Chad, I've got a lot of the dominant sanguine in me, but even with that, that a lot of times the sanguine can be really a lot of times overly optimistic, sometimes to the point of being naive. But there were times when even I, working there, thought, this is not going to make it. Brother Barry came to me one time, and I didn't realize how serious things had gotten, I guess, and I'll never forget it, because he's talking to me, and we're talking about the state of the network and, trying to get through this tough spot we're in financially, and I said something. I don't remember exactly what I said, but basically I was kind of like, so are you saying I might not have a job? And he says, well, we're going to try to get at least 30 days. So if it comes to that, you'll have 30 days to go find a place to preach or a full-time job or something. And so that was when I was kind of like, uh-oh, this is serious. But they pulled through. Realistically, it didn't look like it. And I'm thankful for Brother Barry. I've thought about him a lot, thinking about situations like that, and trying to pinpoint exactly what dominant personality he would have been. But sometimes a melancholy can struggle with pessimism. Depending on how bad it gets, it may borderline being realistic. But sometimes we've got to learn to let go and let God work, right? So again, I understand it's a fine line, and that's sometimes I guess a lot of that you get into individual situations. Is it a time to be realistic, or is it a time to be, more optimistic? Sometimes that would go by situation, but that's a situation, that's something that a melancholy has to be aware of. And then this is the one where we left off: low self-image. The melancholy can tend toward a low self-image, and this is ironic. This is extremely ironic, because the melancholies possess the most talent and ability probably of all the personality types. These, you recall, that was one of the positives, one of the strengths. They're extremely talented, intelligent people. And so how ironic that sometimes they're going to struggle with low self-image. It usually results from negative thinking, and we've talked about this already last week, but every strength, every weakness of the melancholy personality type relates to their thought process. And when they get to negative thinking, then they can develop a low self-image. And I'll tell you where it comes out a lot of times is with criticism. They often struggle handling criticism. Melancholies will struggle with that many times, especially a very dominant melancholy, because every criticism feels just like a personal attack. They struggle with that negative thinking. They may overanalyze people. For example, hello, Bob, how are you doing today? What does he mean by that? Why? Lisa said she has that all the time. Somebody says, how are you doing? Fine. Did he mean I'm doing fine, or did he mean like fine? You see how you could just really overanalyze people, and sometimes we do that, right? And it can happen between friends, it can happen between spouses, and you just go, what do you mean by that? And it may be, where do you want to go eat? I don't care. What does that mean? Does it mean he doesn't care anymore? He doesn't care about me? It may just mean, I don't really care where we go eat. I'm just hungry. Take me somewhere. But you can overanalyze something. You can overanalyze people. It may be that, just somebody saying fine or I'm good, and you begin to, usually when I ask Bob how he's doing, he stops and he wants to talk and tell me, what's going on. But he just said good. Why? Why would he just say good? I think he's upset with me. What did I do? Why is he upset with me? And then and you know what it might be? It might be he's in a rush. He's got to get somewhere. It may be that his mind's preoccupied with something else. This happens a lot. I heard of a situation, this was years ago, but there was a preacher, and he was I think it was in the grocery store, small town. He's in the grocery store, and he's got his cart or basket or whatever, and he walks right by a sister from the congregation. And she smiled and said, hey, how are you? And he just kept walking. And he walked on back, and she stopped. And he just kept going. And she was furious. And she picked up the phone as soon as she got home. This was before everybody had a cell phone, She picked up the phone when she got home. She calls the elders, and she says, I want to know what is, he just completely ignored me. He was just rude to me. And I can't believe this is our preacher. And when the facts came out, the man had just come from a doctor's appointment with his little girl. And I don't remember what it was, but it was something very serious that they had found out she had a health condition. And it was something that was chronic. It was going to be ongoing. And they were just wading into the morass that they were going to try to navigate over the next several years. And his mind was anywhere but there. As you can imagine as a parent, how that must have felt. And so he's just almost sleepwalking through the rest of his day. He never even saw the sister, let alone hear her say, and she even admitted later she barely even spoke. She just kind of nodded, hey, how are you? In a very low tone. He never was even aware. But you see, I don't know that lady's personality type. It might have been melancholy, it might have been something else, but that's an example of overanalyzing something. That's overanalyzing a non-response. But that can happen with the melancholy personality type. It may be an assumption of people who are laughing or whispering across a room. You see people whispering. What are they talking about? They're talking about me. They're talking about me. They're over there whispering about me. Or people are giggling across the room, and you go, man, they're making fun of me. They're over there laughing at me. What's going on? What's wrong with me? Something. Everybody's laughing. And it may be that there's something completely different. It can, and I've seen preachers or Bible class teachers or anybody that gets up in front of an audience, you can struggle with this because there may be something going on behind you that you have no idea about. It might be a typo on the screen. I've had that happen before. I had a typo on the screen and everybody's giggling, and I'm thinking, what's going on? Is something, you're trying to figure it out. And then finally, you realize, I've had some very unfortunate typos that completely changed the message of what was on the screen. And people are giggling or like, oh. And, and I'm sitting here going, what is going on? But then you realize it's something completely different. It has nothing to do with you. So that's just a couple of examples, but you can see how if you overanalyze situations like that too much, it could lead to negative thinking. It could lead to a low self-image. Christians, of course, need to have a healthy image. Why? A healthy self-image. Why is that? Being like Christ. What does Genesis 2:7 tell us? We're made in the image of God. Now, granted, by and large, most people in the world, and a lot of times Christians struggle with it as well, the problem tends to be having too high an image of ourselves. But, people struggle with extremes, and people sometimes struggle with too high self-image, or sometimes they swing to the other opposite, and they struggle with too low a self-image. And by the way, sometimes people appear to be struggling with a really high self-image, and it's a facade because they have a really low self-image. But we want to have healthy self-image because we're made in the image of God. Luke chapter 12, verse 7, Jesus says, even the very hairs of your head are numbered. And he says, fear ye not therefore, for you're of more value than many sparrows. We're of more value to God than the animals. It's not to say God doesn't value animals, but we are the crown. Mankind is the crown of creation. Made a little lower than the angels, Psalm 8 tells us. Crowned with glory and honor. God loves us. He made us in His image. He sent His Son to die for us. Don't tell me you're not important to God Almighty. We need to have a healthy self-image. Again, it's not arrogance, but a realization that our value comes from God. It's a struggle for us as parents, but we've got to get into that fight. I submit to you, we'd better be in the fight to make sure our daughters especially, but even our sons understand your value doesn't come from wearing Abercrombie and Fitch or whatever the latest style is. Your value comes from you are made in the image of God. Your value doesn't come because you wear a certain size or you have muscles that are this big or you're this slim or this big or this tall or whatever. Your value comes because you are a soul. You don't have a soul. You are a soul. You have a body, but you are a soul. And that soul inhabits a body for a very short period of time in the grand scheme of things. And everybody needs to understand, young, old, and in between, you're valuable not because of whatever the world decides is valuable. It's interesting, years ago in many societies, it was the in-fashion thing to be more pale-skinned. And now people become so obsessed with tanning, and they'll spray on tan, and they'll go lay in a tanning bed, and I got to be tan. And, we get so caught up sometimes in images that the world places value on. But God says you're valuable because your soul is made in the image of God. And we need to understand that. But we also need to make sure we remember God's grace. God doesn't love us whether we're melancholy, sanguine, phlegmatic, or choleric. He doesn't love us because we're good enough or nice enough or because we get enough done or because we have enough intelligence or high enough IQ. He loves us simply because of His grace. And let me tell you something. You may be a Christian. God doesn't love you any more as a Christian than He did when you were a sinner. You've changed your state. You've changed your relationship. But He doesn't love you more. He loved you as much when you were His enemy as He ever will. Romans 5:8 tells us that. We need to make sure we understand that. And none more so than a dominant melancholy personality type. God loves you unconditionally. There are things that He demands of us as God, realizing He is the potter and we are the clay. But He doesn't love us more or less. You can change your state, but you won't change God's love towards you. I tell my own children that. I've told some of the teenagers here, I won't always approve of the decisions you make and the things you do, but I'll always love you. And you can't change that. You will never, ever be able to change that. And that's God toward us. He will always love you with an agape love, as we talk about, that looks out for your best interest. And nothing you can do will change that. You could change your state and end up deciding to turn your back on Him and be lost. But it doesn't mean He'll stop loving you. So that ought to give us healthy self-image, understanding that. Looking at, again, these positives and the negatives, the positives being analytical, organized, talented. The melancholy negatives that they will struggle with oftentimes are depression, pessimism, and low self-image. Again, all these positives are sort of tied together. All these negatives are sort of tied together. Very similar when it comes to the melancholy. And they're all related to their thought process, because melancholies are the thinkers. They think. Can you think of a Bible example of a melancholy, if you haven't already looked at this in the book? Does anybody come to mind? I don't know that I really had thought of any of these. Sometimes I was, like when I was reading about choleric, I immediately thought of Paul. Peter comes to mind when you think about a sanguine. Anybody come up with anything for this? Solomon. Have you read the book? Have you not really? See, I never would have gotten Solomon. Jan has. That's the reason I asked. But that's good. When I saw Solomon, I mean, as soon as I saw it in the book, I said, "Oh yeah, perfect example." But it didn't occur to me until I saw it in Tracy's book. Solomon is a good example of a melancholy type. His request in 1 Kings chapter 3, if you want to follow along, I won't read all of it for time's sake, but it's probably familiar to most of us. God essentially comes to him and gives him a blank check and says, "You ask me for what you want." And it's interesting because what do you think a sanguine might have asked God for? I mean, if you have a sanguine personality type, you might already be thinking this. And man, if that was me, I know what I would have asked. Popularity was mentioned. Lord, I want everybody to like me. I want to be a ruler that the people just love. And they say, Solomon's the best king. What else? Might ask for maybe a trip around the world, huh? That's exciting. That's fun. A sanguine's going to focus on something exciting, adventurous. But what about a choleric? They might ask for power, was usually what first comes to mind for a choleric, because he might say, I want to conquer the world. I want to be the most powerful king in the world. That might be what a choleric would ask. Or riches. They might ask for riches. But of course, Solomon didn't ask for any of that. He asked for wisdom. Again, that's related to the thinking. He wants wisdom. Verse 9 of that text is where he says, "Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people?" He asks for wisdom. And you see, melancholies understand that knowledge is power in a very real sense. Or at least this melancholy did. God's reply shows he was very approving of what Solomon asked. In fact, it says, the speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing, verse 10. And so God says, because you've asked this, and you haven't asked for long life, that might be something a sanguine would ask. You haven't asked for riches or the life of thine enemies, that would fall under power. But you've asked for understanding to discern judgment. Behold, I've done according to thy words. Lo, I've given thee a wise and an understanding heart, so that there was none like thee before thee, neither after thee shall any arise like unto thee. And I've also given thee that which thou hast not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be any among the kings like unto thee all thy days. So God approved, obviously, but that's a very classic example of something a melancholy would ask. He's not going to ask for power or riches or popularity. He just, and he doesn't even ask like a phlegmatic mind. I just want peace. I want peace all the days of my reign. He asks for wisdom. So classic response there from a melancholy personality type. Again, when you think about Solomon, think about the temple, the organization and the planning. If we had more time, we could really analyze this in 1 Kings 6 and 7. Just a few examples. 30,000 workers, they're working in shifts. You have 10,000 a month. They work 1 month, they're 2 months at home. I mean, the organization in that is astounding, especially to somebody like me who struggles with that area. Because that's not my dominant personality type. I have a little bit of that in me, but nothing like that. To even try to fathom putting that together just blows my mind. But that's what a melancholy personality type can do. And so you think about the common workers, 70,000 common workers, 80,000 stone cutters, 3,600 foremen over certain groups of people. And of course the same planning, same detail went into his own palace when he built it. This was for the temple. And you recall, what's one of the unique things about the temple? Probably, in my mind, one of the most unique things about the construction of the temple. That also was part of the intricate planning. And you talk about some serious planning that had to accomplish this. They didn't stop the sacrifices. That is also, but that I was thinking, there was never a sound of construction at the temple site, out of reverence for what they're building and who it's for, and it representing the very presence of God among his people. There was never a hammer, a chisel, nothing heard on site. Everything would be, what's the word? Pre-assembled, yeah, or fabric. I don't know if fabricated is the word, but it's all so it'll fit together right there on site. Now, again, that requires some thinking, some planning, some organization, because otherwise you get there and you go, guys, I don't know what you guys were thinking over yonder when you planned this, but it's not fitting together like it's supposed to. That's amazing to me. To me, every time I read that account, that's one of the most amazing things to me is that you have an entire magnificent building constructed without any of the sounds of construction. That's amazing. But, again, this is a great example of a melancholy. I'll tell you another one that Tracy mentions in the book, and we often think of him probably more like a choleric, but he definitely had some, I don't know if it would be his dominant type, but David had some melancholy in him. And you see this in a few different things. He's a talented young musician. 1 Samuel 16 through 18. Saul is having these fits of whatever's going on there. We're not told exactly what all's going on, but to help calm him down and soothe him, David comes in and he plays the harp. He's a very talented musician. Not only that, he's a songwriter, a poet. 2 Samuel 23, verse 1. I was thinking of something else and I just went blank. I'm going to have to look that one up. Or unless I've got it on my cheat sheet here. I don't. Sometimes you know a verse and it leaves you. I know 2 Samuel 23 too, but I can't think of what one is. Is it the sweet psalmist of Israel? It is, okay. That's what I was getting toward. I was thinking I had that somewhere else. But it refers to David as the sweet psalmist of Israel. So he's a poet, a songwriter. Again, many of these written by inspiration, but God using his personality type to write many of the Psalms. He was also a great general in the Lord's army. You look at 2 Samuel chapter 8, really there's take more time than we've got to look at all of this, but here's a man who is a great general. And chapter 8 of 2 Samuel is just filled with his accomplishments as a general in the Lord's army. If you go back to 2 Samuel 22, well, we were in 23 before, but you go to chapter 22, the first couple of verses, that's not right. 1 Samuel, sorry. That makes a difference, doesn't it? 1 Samuel 22. David escapes too. He's on the run from Saul, of course, and he's running for his life. Numerous occasions, at least 2 occasions, where he could have killed Saul, chose not to. But during this time of running from Saul, he's he's escaped to this cave, Adullam, if I'm saying that right. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. He takes this ragtag group of outcasts, and he turns them into quite a military unit. He's got quite a powerful company of men there as this goes on. They're not to be trifled with, I'll tell you that. David, he helped do that, which again shows part of that. You see his choleric and his melancholy side in that, because here's a man who's a leader. But he grabs these people, they come to him, and he turns them into quite a formidable company. And of course, he was also pretty handy with a slingshot or a sling. 1 Samuel 17:49. He went after Goliath. He didn't want the sword. He didn't want the shield. He just took his sling and 5 smooth stones, and he only needed one of those. So definitely seems like he had a melancholy side. There's another example. Has anybody thought of another one? We have covered this before. I actually have preached sermons on this, and it still didn't come to me. I'm a little bit disappointed in myself. When I was thinking about trying to come up with melancholy personality types in the Bible, I still never thought of this fella. He's part of a larger class of people, if that helps any. Do what? Yeah, they might fit in with that. I'm thinking about prophets. In fact, Tracy mentions that this one is, I'm thinking of particular, is Elijah. But Tracy mentions in the book, and I think there's probably something to it, that many of the prophets seem to have been melancholy. Some people have even said they believe all the prophets to have been of a dominant melancholy personality type. These are men that they wanted to relay God's message perfectly. They never watered it down. Boy, you see that with people like Amos, right? I mean, Amos doesn't play. But even some of the other ones that get, we talk about Hosea and the love story that's in Hosea. It's a love story that'll just break your heart because he loved Gomer and she ran around on him and she, he's just constantly having his heart broken by her. And it's a picture of God's relationship with Israel, their spiritual adultery and how they broke his heart with their disobedience. But even, we kind of tend to think of Hosea as a little more soft-spoken, but if you read that book, you'll see, he doesn't water it down, and he doesn't pull punches with the nation either. So, these are men, they want to relay God's message perfectly, not in the sense of sinlessly. Well, they understood they were flawed humanity like the rest of their people. In fact, many times they'll confess sin collectively for the nation. I was reading Jeremiah recently just finished it up in my daily reading, and there are times when Jeremiah will confess collectively for the nation when it's very obvious he's faithfully serving God. But he it was an association with, these are my people. So, and another thing with the prophets, they weren't always popular, but truth was more important. Man, one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture is 1 Kings 22:14, because you've got, what's his name? Ahab, mean old King Ahab, and Jehoshaphat, who was a pretty good man. He was a good ruler for most of his reign over the southern kingdom, but for some foolish, dumb reason, he decides to make an alliance with Ahab. He knew better than that. But they're asking, should we go up to Ramoth-Gilead to battle? And all the prophets are coming for Ahab, and they're all saying what? Yes, you should go up. Now, why are they saying that? Is it because that's what God's saying? It's because that's what he wants to hear. They were yes men. They understood he wants to go to war at Ramoth-Gilead. What he wants to hear is, yes, go with the blessings of God. And so they come and they say, yes, go with the blessing of God. And so then Jehoshaphat, understanding these are just yes men, he at least has enough sense to say, well, is there not a prophet of Jehovah that we can ask? And Ahab says, well, there's Micaiah, but I hate him. He actually says that literally. There is Micaiah, but I hate him. Why does he say he hates him? He always says negative stuff about me. Well, I wonder why. So he says, and Jehoshaphat, still being just goofball Jehoshaphat at this point, where he's not really being very smart, certainly not acting very spiritually minded. And he just kind of says, oh, say it's not so. Let's hear from him. And so they go and they get him, and in verse 14, or maybe the verse before, they essentially tell Micaiah, here's what we're all doing. He wants to go to war. We're telling him to go to war. So how about you play nice, come out here and tell the king to go to war. And Micaiah says in verse 14, as the Lord liveth, whatsoever the Lord saith unto me, that shall I speak. That's a melancholy personality trait. I don't care what you all say. If that had been a sanguine, he'd say, well, guys, I don't want y'all not to like me, but I got to do what's right. Even if he'd been determined to do what was right, he'd have really struggled with that. But Micaiah doesn't bat an eye. He says, I don't care what you say. I don't care what you think. I'm going to say what the word of the Lord is. And if you don't like it, I'm sorry. And if the king doesn't like it, I'm sorry. That's a melancholy personality trait. And of course, these prophets were men who were willing to die for their principles. Again, that's a melancholy. They're not concerned about politics or popularity. They'll die for what's right and for the facts and what is the way it's supposed to be. Yeah, I think John the Baptist would fall under that as well. And really, I mean, he's kind of he wouldn't fall in the same class as the prophets, but kind of like a prophet. I mean, the forerunner for Jesus and all that. But yeah, I mean, he appears before Herod, and Herod puts him in prison and eventually beheads him. John doesn't ever say, hey, let's talk about this. I sure don't want to hurt your feelings, but he was more concerned with the truth and what was right. So that it is interesting when you think about these prophets. But going back to Elijah, the setting there is in 1 Kings 18 and 19. The confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. There hasn't been rain for 3.5 years. Elijah sends one of the other prophets to Ahab to tell him, you meet me at Mount Carmel. And of course, he asks that famous question. What is the question he asks? To all the people. How long halt you between two opinions? If Jehovah is God, then serve him. If Baal is God, then by all means serve Baal. But let's find out once and for all who really is the God. And so you know the thing they go through with they have the two altars, one for Jehovah, one for Baal. And the prophets of Baal, they prepare their sacrifice. They've got their wood, and they cry out for Baal to send down fire and to consume the sacrifice. They even cut themselves with rocks. They're screaming. They're carrying on. And Elijah, he even begins to mock them. Now, he's not trying just to be funny or poking fun at somebody or to be rude. He's wanting to make sure he drives home the point. Cry a little louder. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe Baal's hard of hearing. Maybe he's on vacation. Call out a little louder. Maybe he's sleeping. Maybe you just need to yell louder and wake him up. And of course, he's driving home the point. He can't hear you because he is nothing. And so then Elijah, this is before the rain, 3.5 years drought, says, put a barrel of water on that altar. And so they do it. That must have shocked some people, don't you know? And he says, do it again. Again? Again. And then he says, do it again. Are you sure? I'm sure. And then he cries out once to Jehovah. And the fire comes down and consumes the sacrifice, the altar, laps up the water. I mean, it just consumed everything. And even the people cry out, the Lord, He is the God. Jehovah, He is the God. And I mean, we've talked about it before. What a great victory that was, right? And you know, it shows who truly is God. Now, in a perfect world, what happens with Ahab and especially Jezebel after this incident? I mean, well, in a perfect world, they come on their hands and knees begging for forgiveness. We have been so wrong. We've been worshiping Baal, and clearly Baal is nothing. It's just an idol, a concoction of people's mind. And Jehovah, He is the God, and we're going to change our ways. And then we're going to turn this nation around as king and queen, and we're going to serve God Almighty. And anybody who doesn't, they're going to be punished. That's what happens in a perfect world. But you know what? We ain't living in a perfect world. Far from it. And so what happens? Jezebel says, this time tomorrow, Elijah, those prophets of Baal that you killed, that was their punishment from God. They were killed. But those prophets you killed, Elijah, you're going to be like one of them this time tomorrow. Don't you know, for a melancholy personality, how depressing that would have been? I mean, you're thinking, this is it. They have seen it now with their own eyes. There's no turning away. They're going to turn back to God. And we're going to get the nation back on track. But no, she says, I'm going to make you like one of them. In an imperfect world, somebody like Jezebel sometimes is as hard-hearted and stubborn as they come. You think about Moses appearing before Pharaoh, miracle after miracle after miracle. Surely this is the one. He'll let Israel go. Now he'll let Israel go. Surely now. Sure. Even when he sends them away, he goes chasing after them in the wilderness. Can you imagine if you're Moses and the people cry out and you say, what? What could it possibly be this time? Are you kidding me? He's coming after us? In an imperfect world, some people are just stubborn and hard-hearted. Elijah's so depressed that he asked to die there in chapter 19, verse 4. Take my life, Lord. There you see that melancholy pessimism. He just wants to die. It seems realistic to feel this way. I mean, seeing the leaders of the nation, even the priests, corrupted, serving idols. These are God's people. And realistically, it probably did feel like he is the only one left who cares about doing right and serving Jehovah. But he'd forgotten the key element, and that's God. You see, God knew things that Elijah didn't know, like the 7,000 who were faithful. Chapter 9, verse 18, or 19, verse 18, he says, I've reserved to me 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You don't know what you're talking about, Elijah. Now, it's interesting because God treats him very gently in this passage. Here's a man he's in a pretty fragile state, I think. If you study this account, you get here and you see he's very fragile. God doesn't say, get up, sissy. He doesn't say, man up. He's going to deal with him very gently, but he is going to tell him, Elijah, there are things you don't know. Like the 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. You're not the only one, Elijah. I've still got work for you to do. And incidentally, he gives him work to do as part of how he helps him out of this. Sometimes when we get, especially that melancholy personality, any personality type, when you get in the depths of despair and grief and disappointment, sometimes what we need to do is to find a task and to get involved in that. And that's what God gives him, actually several different tasks in that context there, chapter 19. But Elijah, and really especially all melancholies, had to learn God is sometimes doing his work quietly in the world. And sometimes we don't see it. In fact, when God speaks to Elijah there in chapter 19, how does it happen? It's not in an earthquake. It's not in it's the still small voice. I think there's something in that just to let us know that God is sometimes working very quietly, subtly in the world. Sometimes we want to see a big explosion of what God is doing. And sometimes it happens in a more obvious way. You know, and especially when you get back to the time where there were actual miracles occurring. I mean, sometimes the Jordan River stops and then parts and there's dry land. I mean, that's a sanguine moment right there, isn't it? It just, it happens and boom, there it is. Sometimes the Red Sea would, part. And there it is, congealed on either side and you just walk through. But sometimes it's that still small voice working of God. But here's the point I want to get to. In an imperfect world, Elijah had a perfect father who's looking out for him. And that's what we need to realize. All personality types, but especially the melancholy. That's a good stopping point for us because next week we're going to start talking about the master personality. Reckon who that might be? Jesus Christ. And what you're going to see as we go through this is Jesus had a little bit of every personality type, all the strengths and none of the weaknesses. And it really is amazing as you go through and study the life of Jesus, the sanguine Savior and the choleric Christ, and so on we'll go, the phlegmatic Prince of Peace and the melancholy Messiah. But Lord willing, we'll pick up right there next week and begin talking about the master personality. Thank you very much. Laurel's doing her best to get them quiet.